At 38 years old, Laurel Price owned three things worth counting: a 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and a passenger seat that wouldn't lock back into the upright position, a cardboard box from the VA hospital in Staunton, Virginia, containing
I'm right where
everything
you
her
said to
father had
meet.
accumulated in
Where are
71
you?
years of living,
It's getting
and a
dark and I can't
studio
wait much
apartment
longer.
above Birch Street Laundry in Harrisonburg, where the walls vibrated every time the commercial washers hit their spin cycle, which was most of the day and most of the night.
The harvest is plentiful,
Everything
but
else
the
was
laborers
gone.
are
The house
few.
in Kieseltown
We
had
must
gone to
be
Marcus
ready
in
when the
settlement.
time comes,
The
child.
savings account, 4 years of careful putting away, had gone to the lawyer she'd hired 3 days before the first hearing. The second car, the furniture, the retirement account she'd barely started. All of it restructured and redistributed by a judge who'd spent 45 minutes on a marriage that had taken 11 years to build and 8 months to legally end. She didn't tell people about the divorce. Not Pauline at the diner, not the women at the fulfillment center who had their own versions of the same trouble. There was nothing to say that would change the numbers on the refrigerator door. The refrigerator door. She kept a list there. 2 columns written in black marker on the back of a takeout menu from Carver's Diner, the place where she worked mornings. The left column said, "Pay now." The right column said, "Pay when you can." The right column was always longer. She worked mornings at Carver's on Route 11 vinyl booths, a laminated menu that hadn't changed since 2004. A kitchen window where the cook, a man named Ray, slid plates across the ledge and called out numbers in a voice that was never quite loud enough and never quite quiet enough. Laurel poured coffee and refilled ketchup bottles and bussed tables, and on a good day walked out with $40 in tips. On a bad day, closer to 20. Evenings, she drove 20 minutes east to Fuller Logistics and packed shipping boxes until 2 in the morning. She got home at 2:30, set her alarm for 6, did it again. On weekends, she had Willa. Marcus had her the other 5 days. That was the arrangement the court approved, and Laurel's lawyer, the one she'd found 3 days before the first hearing, hadn't pushed for more. Weekends meant Saturday morning pickup at the house in Kieseltown, the house that still had her curtains in the windows and her garden beds along the south wall, and Sunday evening drop-off. 48 hours where Laurel could pretend her life still had a shape to it. Willa was 9 years old and carried a library book everywhere she went. Not the same book. A different one each week, always thick, always about something specific. Girl detectives, deep-sea creatures, the history of bridges. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's way of going quiet before she said something that mattered. Laurel did not talk about the divorce to Willa. Some things a 9-year-old understood without being told, and Willa was the kind of 9-year-old who understood most things. Owen Price died on a Tuesday in March. The call came at 6 in the morning. A nurse at the VA hospital in Staunton, her name was Harriet, and her voice had the particular gentleness of someone who had made this call many times before, told Laurel that her father had passed in his sleep during the night. No distress, she said. No pain. Laurel thanked her and hung up and sat on the edge of her mattress. She slept on a mattress on the floor because the bed frame was still in Kieseltown, and stared at the water stain on the ceiling above the bathroom door for a long time. She didn't cry. She wasn't sure what she felt. Something heavy sat behind her ribs, but it didn't have a name yet. It was the weight of a thing not finished. Not grief exactly. Something older than grief and quieter. The funeral was Thursday. 5 people came. Laurel, Willa, a neighbor from Owen's apartment building named Mrs. Alderman, who brought a casserole wrapped in foil and smelled faintly of lavender. The pastor from Calvary Methodist, a church Owen had attended 4 or 5 times a year. And a man from the local VFW post named Gerald, who introduced himself with a firm handshake and said Owen had been a member for 20 years. Quiet man, Gerald said, always the first one to show up when something needed moving. Never stayed for the meal after. The service lasted 22 minutes. The pastor called Owen a man of few words who served his country and then served his community without drawing attention to himself. Laurel stood holding Willa's hand and listened and thought that this was the most accurate and also the most incomplete description of her father she had ever heard. After the service, Mrs. Alderman pressed the casserole dish into Laurel's hands. "Your father fixed my garbage disposal last November," she said. I offered to pay him. He said no. He just knocked on my door one Saturday morning with a wrench and said he'd noticed it was making a noise through the wall. Laurel thanked her. She put the casserole in the car and drove back to Harrisonburg. She ate half of it standing at the kitchen counter, covered the rest in plastic wrap, and put it in the refrigerator next to the list. Owen Price had been a groundskeeper for Shenandoah County Parks for 32 years. That was his career. 32 years of mowing and trimming and repairing irrigation lines and repainting benches and replacing the wooden posts on trail markers after winter ice took them down. He retired with a small pension, moved into a one-bedroom apartment on Maple Avenue, and drove a 2001 Chevy truck with a crack in the dashboard and a passenger window that didn't roll all the way down. He didn't travel. He didn't go to restaurants, not unless Laurel insisted, and even then he'd study the menu like a man reviewing a legal document and order the thing that cost the least. On weekends, he said he went fishing. He'd always said he went fishing. For as long as Laurel could remember, Saturday morning meant Owen's truck backing out of the driveway or later backing out of the parking lot of the Maple Avenue apartments and the quiet that settled over things after he left. She had never asked where he fished. That was a thing she had simply accepted, the way she had accepted a lot of things about Owen. He was a man who lived in the spaces between conversations. You could be in the same room with him for 2 hours and come away with the feeling that something real had passed between you, but no clear memory of what either of you had actually said. When Laurel's mother left, Laurel was 11. She remembered standing at the kitchen window watching the car pull down the driveway. Her mother's name was Diane, and she was going to her sister's in Roanoke, and she was not coming back. Laurel had understood that without anyone telling her. Owen had stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder, and he hadn't said anything. He hadn't chased the car or called after it or done any of the things that movies suggested a man was supposed to do in that moment. He had just stood there until the car turned the corner and disappeared, and then he had gone to the kitchen and started making dinner. Spaghetti. She remembered that detail with strange precision, the sound of the pot filling with water, the click of the gas burner, the smell of jarred tomato sauce warming in the pan. They had eaten in silence, and he had done the dishes, and in the morning he had gone to work. Laurel had loved her father. She had also spent most of her adult life quietly frustrated with him. Not for what he'd done, for what he hadn't. He hadn't fought for her mother. He hadn't pushed for anything more than what life handed him. He hadn't asked the hard questions about Marcus when asking them might have made a difference. He had existed quietly for 71 years, and now he had stopped, and the sum total of what he'd left behind was a box of personal effects that fit on the passenger seat of her Civic without any of it touching the dashboard. 3 days after the funeral, she drove to the VA hospital in Staunton to collect his things. Harriet, the nurse who had called, met her in the hallway outside the ward. She had kind eyes and a lanyard badge with a small photo that made her look slightly startled. She handed Laurel a cardboard box and said Owen had been well liked on the ward. "He fixed the cabinet in our break room," Harriet said. "Nobody asked him to. He just showed up one morning with a screwdriver and had it done by lunch." Laurel looked at the box. "That sounds like him. He talked about you." Harriet paused. "He kept a picture of you and your daughter on his nightstand. He told me once that you were stronger than you knew." She paused again, and her voice went a little softer. "He was proud of you." Laurel didn't know what to say to that. She thanked the nurse and carried the box to the parking lot and sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine, looking at the box on the passenger seat and thinking about a man who told a nurse at the VA hospital that his daughter was stronger than she knew, but had apparently never found a way to say it to her directly. She sat there long enough that the parking lot filled up and then emptied out a little, and a cloud moved over the sun and then moved off again. Then she started the car and drove home. That night, after her shift at Fuller Logistics, she sat on the floor of the apartment with the box between her knees. 2:30 in the morning. The laundromat below was quiet for once. The building wasn't vibrating. The only sound was the occasional pass of a car on Birch Street and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, where the list was still taped to the door. She pulled out Owen's reading glasses first. Wireframes, one arm held on with a small coil of electrical tape, the tape gone brown with age. She set them on the carpet beside her. The flannel shirt came next, green and brown plaid worn so many times through so many washings that the fabric had taken on a quality almost like skin supple and weightless. She held it to her face and breathed in. It smelled like cut grass and bar soap, and something else she had no name for, something faintly sweet, a smell she associated with Owen specifically and nothing else in the world. She had never been able to identify it. She folded the shirt carefully and set it on the kitchen counter. There was the pocket watch, brass and old, heavier than it looked. The back was engraved with his initials ORP, and beneath them the word, served, the lettering worn shallow from years of handling. The crystal was cracked along one edge, and the hands had stopped at 417. She didn't know if that was the time he died. She didn't know if she wanted to know. A small bundle of letters held together with a rubber band. She set those aside to look at later. Two photographs, one of Laurel at her college graduation squinting into the sun, one of Willa, maybe 6 years old, standing in a garden with a handful of beans she'd just pulled, grinning. And then the Bible. It was old brown leather, cracked along the spine and worn smooth at the corners from decades of handling. A rubber band held it shut, the rubber gone brittle and slightly sticky. She slipped the rubber band off, and the Bible fell open to somewhere in the middle. Psalms, she thought, though she didn't look closely. The pages were tissue-thin, and some of them were dog-eared, and some were marked with pencil. Owen had underlined passages throughout. He'd written small notes in the margins in his careful, precise printing, the same handwriting she'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists her entire life. She ran her thumb along the spine. It felt wrong. She stopped, pressed the binding between her fingers more carefully. There was a ridge underneath the leather, something flat and stiff tucked between the outer leather and the inner lining. She pressed again. Definitely there. Not thick an inch, maybe less. But something had been placed inside this binding deliberately. She turned the Bible over and studied the back cover under the lamp. The inner edge of the binding had been carefully opened and then resewn. The new thread was slightly lighter than the original. The difference was subtle, but once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. This was intentional work. Someone had cut the binding open, placed something inside, and stitched it closed again. Laurel went to the kitchen drawer and came back with scissors. She cut the stitching slowly, working one thread at a time, easing the leather apart. The flaps separated. Inside, pressed flat and folded twice, was a single piece of paper. She pulled it out, unfolded it, held it under the lamp. A property deed, filed with the Rockingham County Recorder's Office. Property of Owen Raymond Price, 47 acres. A parcel number and legal description filled the center of the page. Recorded October 14th, 1989. Purchase price $2,200. She read it twice. She turned it over. The back was blank. She looked at the Bible sitting open on the carpet in front of her, and then at the deed in her hands, and felt the floor shift underneath everything she thought she knew about her father. Owen Price, the groundskeeper. The man who drove a truck held together by habit and drove it until the odometer stopped registering. The man who ate canned soup 3 nights a week and wore the same 4 flannel shirts in rotation for decades, and had never once in all the years Laurel had known him suggested that he had anything other than exactly what was visible. He had owned 47 acres of land for 34 years. He had told nobody. Laurel did not sleep that night. At 5 in the morning, she sat at the kitchen counter with her laptop and searched the Rockingham County Assessor's website. The parcel was listed. Owen R. Price owner. Taxes paid through the previous year from a post office box in a town called Singer's Glen. The assessed value was modest, rural, unincorporated, no municipal water or sewer. The land itself was not remarkable on paper, but there was a note in the record: improvements on parcel, significant. She called the county assessor's office when it opened at 8. "Yes, that parcel's active," the woman on the phone said. "Taxes are current. No liens, no encumbrances. Can you tell me what the improvements are?" "The record just shows improvements significant. I don't have details on what kind. You'd have to go out and see for yourself." Laurel thanked her and hung up. She sat with her coffee going cold and stared at the deed on the counter beside her laptop. 47 acres. Significant improvements. 34 years of Saturday mornings she had believed her father spent fishing. She went to work. She poured coffee and ran plates and smiled at regulars and folded the deed into her apron pocket where she could feel its folded edge against her hip for every hour of every table she turned that morning. That night at Fuller Logistics, she packed boxes and thought about 47 acres. On Saturday morning, she picked Willa up at the house in Kieseltown at 9 o'clock. Willa was already on the porch when Laurel pulled up, sitting on the front step, with her library book open across her knees, a thick one this week. Something about the engineering of suspension bridges in a small canvas backpack already on. She climbed into the back seat and buckled her belt without being asked. "Where are we going?" Willa asked. "South. I need to see something your grandpa left." Willa looked up from her book. Like a present, Laurel glanced in the rearview mirror. "I don't know yet." They drove south on I-81 for 40 minutes, then took the exit for Route 33 East. The strip malls and chain restaurants thinned out. The land opened up, rolling pastures, split-rail fence lines, farmhouses set back a quarter-mile from the road with their backs to the mountains. The Blue Ridge ran along the eastern horizon, layered in blue-gray, the color of old denim. "It's pretty out here," Willa said. Her forehead was against the window. "It is. Did Grandpa come out here a lot?" "I think so. Every weekend, maybe. I just found out about it." Willa was quiet for a moment, the way she got quiet before she said something real. "Why didn't he tell anyone?" Laurel looked at her daughter in the mirror. The question hung in the car between them. "That is a very good question," she said. The GPS directed them east, then south, then onto a county road that hadn't been paved since sometime in the previous century. The road cracked and narrowed, the tree line pressed close on both sides, oak and hickory, mostly old ones, the trunks wide enough that you couldn't put your arms around them. Half a mile in, Laurel saw it on the right side of the road, a gap in the fence line, and a metal gate rusted but standing, held closed by a simple iron latch. No padlock, no mailbox, no name. She pulled onto the shoulder and turned off the engine. "Is this it?" Willa asked. "I think so." They sat for a moment. Laurel looked at the gate and the track beyond it disappearing into the shade of the old trees. The only sound was the wind in the crowns overhead and the distant call of something she couldn't identify. "Okay," she said. She got out and pushed the gate open. It moved smoothly, the hinges oiled and quiet, which told her something without her quite being able to say what. She got back in the car and drove through. The track curved between the old oaks. The canopy closed overhead, dimming the morning light to something green and still. Gravel popped softly under the tires. Willa had pressed her face against the window again. A quarter mile and the trees opened up. Laurel stopped the car. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Willa's book had slid off her lap onto the seat beside her, and she didn't reach for it. What Laurel saw was this: a house first. Small, single-story, wood-sided, with a covered porch across the front and dark green shutters on the windows. A metal roof gone green with age in the patches where lichen had found purchase. The porch railing was smooth, and even the kind of smooth that comes from hand sanding with care. Behind the house and to the right, a workshop with wide double doors. A garden beyond that with raised beds and wooden trellises, overgrown, but clearly planned, once clearly tended, once the bones of something deliberate still visible in the layout. And then, to the left of all of it, rising from the ground on a stone foundation as wide as a small house, the mill. It was 4 stories tall, 4 full stories of gray granite fieldstone, the blocks fitted together without mortar in the old way, each stone chosen and placed to lock against the next. The walls were 2 feet thick at the base, angled slightly inward, as they rose the way a fortress wall angles built, to carry weight, built to last. The first floor had a single wide doorway with a timber lintel and 2 deep-set windows with wooden shutters. The upper floors each had smaller windows, evenly spaced, each one perfectly square. And at the top, the cap, an octagonal wooden cap weathered silver gray, and from it extending in 4 directions the arms. Four great arms of white oak, each one 40 feet from tip to tip, the sails still hanging between them, canvas that had been replaced more recently than the wood that held it, still pale, still whole. As Laurel sat in the car and watched, one of the arms moved, slowly, barely perceptibly, the way a minute hand moves if you watch it long enough. But it moved. The mill was turning. Willa's voice came out as something barely above a whisper. Mama, did Grandpa build that? Laurel couldn't answer. Her hands were still on the steering wheel. She was looking at the mill, this tower of gray stone and white oak rising out of the Virginia countryside. This thing that had no business being here, and yet stood with the settled permanence of something that had always been here, that would always be here long after everything else around it had been replaced and rebuilt and replaced again. She thought about Owen. Owen who drove a truck held together by habit. Owen who ate soup from a can. Owen who fixed garbage disposals for neighbors who didn't ask, and who left for work each morning with a thermos of coffee, and came home in the evening with grass on his boots, and said nothing about what he had done that day that wasn't visible on his boots. Owen who had told a nurse at the VA hospital that his daughter was stronger than she knew. She got out of the car. The air hit her immediately different from Harrisonburg, cleaner and cooler, and carrying something underneath the smell of grass and turned soil, something sweet and faintly floral. Apple blossoms. She hadn't noticed the orchard from the car, but she could see it now, stretching away to the south behind the mill rows of trees. 80 or more of them, evenly spaced, the early spring blossoms, just beginning to open. Willa was beside her. She had left the bridge book on the car seat without marking her page, which was a thing she almost never did. They stood together in the morning light and looked at the mill. There was a border collie at the edge of the orchard, black and white, medium-sized ears, forward watching them with the careful attention of an animal that has learned to read people slowly and accurately. He didn't move toward them. He didn't back away. He stood about 40 feet off and watched, his head tilted slightly to one side. Willa saw him. Look, I see him. Stay close. They walked toward the house first. The porch steps were solid under Laurel's weight, no give, no creak. She ran her hand along the railing and felt the care in it. Not contractor work, something more particular than that. This was a person who had come back to the same piece of wood again and again, who had sanded it and sanded it and sanded it until the grain came up like something living. The front door was unlocked. She turned the knob and pushed. Inside, cool air and dust and order. The dust sat on everything in a thin, even coat, the kind that accumulates over months, not years, meaning someone had been here recently enough that the dust was only beginning to settle again. The main room had a cast-iron wood stove against the north wall, an armchair, and floor-to-ceiling shelves built into the east and west walls. The shelves were empty, waiting. The kitchen was small, a cast-iron sink, a two-burner propane stove, a counter made from a single wide plank of wood, one continuous surface, the grain running the full length of it. A bedroom through a doorway to the left, a bed frame built from the same timber as the shelves, a mattress still in its factory plastic, a nightstand with a single drawer. The window faced south toward the orchard. Willa moved through the room, slowly touching things lightly. She touched the shelf boards. She touched the windowsill. She looked at the wood stove as if she were trying to understand how it worked just by looking at it. Everything in the house was made by hand. Laurel could see it in the joinery, in the way the shelf brackets fit into the wall with a precision that no prefabricated bracket achieves. This was not a contractor's work. This was one person with saws and planes and chisels and sandpaper, and the particular stubbornness of someone who cares more about getting it right than about getting it done. 700 square feet, maybe. A place for one person or for two people who didn't need much. A place built slowly, piece by piece, by someone who had a clear idea of what it should be and the patience to wait until it was. Then Laurel saw the table. Kitchen table square, same wood as the counter. One chair pushed in, and on the table, centered with deliberate care, a white envelope. Her name was written on the front in pencil. Owen's handwriting, that careful, small, slightly right-leaning print she had known since she was old enough to read. She would have known it anywhere. She picked up the envelope. It was heavier than paper alone. She felt it between her fingers. Something solid inside. Something small and metallic. A key. Willa had come to stand in the doorway. She was looking at the shelves, at the light coming through the kitchen window, at the dust floating in the beam of it. Mama, what is it? Laurel looked at her daughter. Then she looked at the envelope in her hands. Her father's handwriting, her name in a house she had never known existed on 47 acres she had never known he owned. She slid her thumb under the sealed flap. Inside a single sheet of paper wrapped around a brass key, small and old, the head rounded and worn smooth from handling. She unfolded the paper. Owen's handwriting, the same small, careful print. She read it standing at the kitchen table with Willa watching from the doorway. Laurel, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you found what I hid. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you in person. I tried to start that conversation 100 times, and I never got past the first sentence. This property is yours. Everything I built here is for you and for Willa. The key opens the wood shop. Start there. There are other letters around the place. You'll find them when you're ready. I numbered them so you'd know the order. This one doesn't have a number because it isn't part of the set. It's just me saying, I'm sorry I was the kind of father who built things instead of saying things. I hope what I built is enough. Dad. Laurel read it twice. She folded it and put it in her back pocket and looked at the key in her palm. What did it say? Willa asked. It said the key opens the wood shop. Can we go? Yeah, let's go. They walked off the porch and across the yard toward the workshop. The border collie had moved while they were inside. He was closer now, maybe 25 feet off, sitting upright in the grass, with his ears forward. Willa waved at him. His tail moved once against the ground. The workshop had a padlock on the wide double doors. Laurel tried the key. It turned on the first attempt. She pulled the padlock free, lifted the latch, and swung the doors open. The light poured in. The workshop was larger than the house, 30 feet deep and 20 wide, with a workbench running the full length of the back wall and pegboard above it, hung with tools. Hand saws and planes, chisels and clamps, levels and squares and marking gauges, everything organized and clean under the same thin coat of dust that covered everything else on the property. The tools were Owen's tools. She recognized a few of them from childhood. The hand plane with the wooden handle she'd watched him use on her bedroom door when it wouldn't close right. The clamps he'd used on everything from furniture repairs to a broken chair leg. But the tools were not what stopped her in the doorway. The floor of the workshop was filled with furniture. Tables and chairs, a bookshelf tall enough to touch the ceiling of the workshop. 2 matching benches, a dresser with 6 drawers, a rocking chair small enough to be a child's rocking chair, a nightstand, a long dining table with tapered legs and clean straight lines, a side table, a set of wooden coat hooks mounted on a painted board. Every piece finished sanded, stain sealed. Every piece in the particular warm brown of oiled walnut, smooth and deep. And on every piece a strip of masking tape in Owen's handwriting. Laurel walked in slowly. She touched the dining table. The tape read, "For Laurel's kitchen." She moved to the tall bookshelf. "For Laurel's main room." The small rocking chair. "For Willa." The dresser. "For Laurel's bedroom." One of the benches. Porch faces the orchard. The nightstand. Bedroom east window. The side table. By the front window, main room. The coat hooks. Inside the front door. There was a cutting board thick and wide and heavy made from alternating strips of walnut and maple. The tape read "Kitchen" by the stove. Laurel stood in the middle of the workshop and turned slowly. Her father had built furniture for every room of this house. He had built it in this workshop piece by piece and labeled each piece with the room it belonged to. And he had done all of this for a life she hadn't known was waiting for her. For rooms she had never stood in. For a house she hadn't known existed. He had made a dining table for her kitchen and a rocking chair for her daughter. and a bookshelf for her main room, and he had labeled all of it and stored it here and driven home every Sunday evening to a one-bedroom apartment on Maple Avenue and said nothing. Willa had followed her in. She found the rocking chair and ran her hand along the arm. She sat down in it. The chair rocked smoothly, evenly on a floor that Owen had leveled by hand. "This one has my name on the tape," Willa said. "I know. Grandpa made this." "He did." Willa rocked once, twice. She looked up at Laurel with an expression that was part wonder and part something harder to read. Something older than her face, something careful. "He must have been working on all of this for a very long time," she said. Laurel could not answer that. She pressed her hand flat against the dining table and breathed. The wood was warm from the morning sun coming through the open doors. Outside, the mill arms were moving. Slowly. The way they had always been moving, the way they had been moving every weekend for 30 years, while Laurel was somewhere else believing her father was fishing. Outside, gravel crunched under tires. Laurel stepped to the workshop door and looked out. An old blue pickup had come up the dirt track and stopped in the yard. The border collie had moved to the far side of the yard and was sitting upright, alert, but not alarmed, his ears tracking the truck. The door opened and a man climbed out. Tall and lean, white hair under a cap that read Rockingham Feed and Grain in faded red stitching. He wore a work shirt the color of old clay and boots that had been resoled at least once. He moved with the careful economy of a man who had been strong for a long time and was now in negotiation with the parts of himself that remembered it. He saw Laurel and stopped. He took off his cap. He looked at her for a long moment, not with surprise exactly, but with the expression of a man whose long-held question has just been answered. "Help you," he said. "I'm Laurel Price," she said. "Owen's daughter." The man's face changed. Something in it settled. "Owen's girl," he said quietly. He put his cap back on. "I'm Everett Boone. I live up the road about a quarter mile. Been watching the place since Owen stopped coming." "You knew him?" 30 years of Saturday morning coffee." "Yes, I did." Laurel stepped down from the workshop doorway. "He came here every weekend. Every weekend I can remember. He'd pull in Friday night, sometimes early Saturday morning. We'd have coffee on my porch around 8. Then he'd work all day Saturday, most of Sunday, whatever it was that week, planting, building repairs, whatever needed doing. He'd drive home Sunday evening, never missed for 30 years, give or take." Everett looked at the mill. He looked at the orchard. He looked at the house with its green shutters and the smooth porch railing. "I moved onto my place in 1990, he said. Owen was already here. The house was maybe half done. The first orchard trees were in the ground, 8-10 of them. He'd been at it about a year by then." Willa had come to stand beside Laurel. She was looking at Everett with the direct assessing attention she gave to people she was deciding whether to trust. "This your girl," Everett said. "This is Willa." Everett nodded at her. "You've got your grandpa's eyes." Willa studied him. "Did you know my grandpa?" "I did. He was a good man. Quiet but good." "Everyone says he was quiet," Willa said. Everett smiled. It was a small smile, private, the kind a person makes when they're remembering something they're not ready to share fully. "Well, he was. But quiet doesn't mean empty. Your grandpa said more with a fence post and a hammer than most people say in a year." Laurel looked at the orchard. The rows of trees stretched south into the morning light, the blossoms pale and open, the bees just beginning to move between them. 3 hives sat on a low platform at the orchard's eastern edge, painted white facing south. "Can you show us around?" Laurel asked. "I'd be glad to." They walked the property together, the 4 of them, Laurel and Willa and Everett, and the border collie who had decided to follow at a distance of about 15 feet, close enough to be included, far enough to keep his own counsel. "The orchard first. 84 trees," Everett said. "Owen planted 3 or 4 years, sometimes 5 if he had a good autumn for it. The earliest ones were grown now, their trunks as thick as Laurel's forearm, the bark furrowed and dark." Everett pointed out the varieties: wine saps along the south row, Arkansas blacks. On the western edge, Newtown, pippins in the center, and in one corner a cluster of trees that were different, the leaves a slightly different shape. "Those he grafted," Everett said. Took scion wood from a wine sap that had a natural resistance to fire blight and grafted it onto pippin rootstock. Learned how from a library book. Checked it out from the singer's Glen branch. Practiced the technique on sticks in his woodshop first. He never mentioned any of this to me, Laurel said. Everett walked a few steps before he answered. Owen didn't mention much of anything to anyone. I learned early on not to ask personal questions. He'd answer if he wanted to. Mostly he didn't. They came to the beehives. 3 colonies on the low platform, the entrances busy in the morning warmth. I've been tending them since Owen went into the VA, Everett said. I'm no beekeeper. I do my best. Check the frames, make sure they've got feed if they need it. He could sit next to a hive, Everett added, and they wouldn't bother him. He'd talk to them. Low quiet. Like he was telling them something he didn't want anyone to hear. Laurel looked at the hives. Owen talking to bees. It should have seemed strange, and it didn't, and the fact that it didn't told her something. Behind the workshop, a path led down a gentle slope to a stone-lined opening set into the hillside, the root cellar. Everett pulled open the heavy wooden door and they stepped inside. It was cool and dark and smelled of earth and vinegar and something dried and sweet. Shelves lined both walls from floor to ceiling, and on the shelves, mason jars. Dozens and dozens of mason jars. Apple butter and apple cider vinegar, and peach preserves, and pickled green beans, and canned tomatoes, and blackberry jam, and dried herbs in paper bags labeled in Owen's printing. Rosemary, thyme, sage, oregano, sweet marjoram, eat. He spent September and October putting things up, Everett said. Every year. Brought me a jar of apple butter at Christmas. Best I ever had. Willa picked up a jar of peach preserves and held it to the thin light from the doorway. The glass was dusty, but the contents were golden. Can we eat these? They're sealed, right? Everett said. Should be fine. Laurel looked at the shelves. Row upon row of food preserved and labeled and stored. A man making sure there would be enough. A man stocking a kitchen for someone who didn't know yet that the kitchen was theirs. They came to the spring last. Behind the property, past the orchard's southern edge, a narrow path through a stand of birch trees led to a rock face where water seeped from a fissure and collected in a shallow stone basin before running off downhill. Owen had tested it, Everett said. Every couple of years, never failed. He'd run a gravity line to the house, a simple setup, nothing complicated but reliable. They stood by the spring for a moment. Laurel listened to the water. Willa crouched and put one finger in the basin and pulled it back. Everett, Laurel said. He waited. Did he ever tell you who he was building it for? Everett took off his cap and ran his palm across his white hair and put the cap back on. He looked at the birch trees. At the orchard beyond. He told me once, Everett said. We were sitting on my porch. This was maybe 10 years ago. He'd just finished the mill cap, the octagonal top piece, the whole housing for the gear mechanism. It had taken him 3 years to get the joinery right. He was tired that evening, but he looked, I don't know the right word, satisfied maybe. And he said, I'm building something for someone who doesn't know she needs it yet. Everett paused. That's all he said. I didn't ask who. I figured he'd tell me when he was ready. He looked at Laurel steadily. I guess he told you instead, he said. Laurel didn't answer. She looked at the spring running over its stone basin and at the birch trees filtering the morning light and at the orchard beyond with its 84 trees planted 3 or 4 at a time over 30 years. She tried to put together the man she had known, the quiet man with the soup cans and the flannel shirts, and the truck that needed 2 good turns of the key in winter with the man who had done all of this. They walked back toward the mill. At the base of it, Laurel stopped and put her hand against the stone. It was warm from the morning sun. The granite had the rough texture of something taken straight from the earth, which is what it was. Field stone pulled from the ground of this property or carried from the creek bed fitted by hand. She could see the individual decisions in the wall. This stone here because its shape bridged a gap, this one there, because its flat face would take the weight of the 3 above it. 30 years of decisions, 30 years of Saturdays. Everett said he'd better get back to feed his own animals. He wrote his phone number on the back of a hardware store receipt, a 540 area code local, and handed it to Laurel. "Anything you need," he said. "I'm a quarter mile up the road." He tipped his cap to Willa. "Nice to meet you, young lady." "You too," Willa said. She had been watching him with that steady, assessing attention the whole walk, and something in her expression said she had made her decision. They watched his truck rumble back down the dirt track through the oaks and disappear. Then Laurel went back into the workshop. The border collie had moved again. He was sitting about 15 feet from the open doors, now his chin not quite on his paws, watching. When Laurel moved, his eyes moved. When she stopped, he was still. She ran her hands along the workbench, pulled open drawers. The first had hardware nails and screws sorted into coffee cans by size, each can labeled in Owen's printing. The second had sandpaper and graduated grits stacked neatly, the sheets still full. The third drawer she opened had something different inside. An envelope, small and white. The number 2 written on the front in pencil. Owen's handwriting. Laurel picked it up. She sat down on the workshop floor with her back against the workbench and her legs stretched out in the afternoon light coming through the open doors, and she opened it. "Laurel, if you found this one, you've been going through the drawers, which means you're curious, which means you're starting to understand what this place is." "Good. The wood planes need oil twice a year. Use the linseed oil in the can under the bench, not the tung oil. Tung is for finishing, not conditioning. The chisels are sharp. Use the gloves in the top drawer. The handsaw on the right of the pegboard is the good one. The other one pulls left. I keep meaning to fix it." Then a space, then, "You were standing at that window and you didn't make a sound. You were 11 years old and you stood there without making a sound, and I wanted to tell you it was okay to cry. I tried to say it. The words wouldn't come out. They never did, the important ones. I spent my whole life not being able to say what I meant to the people I meant to say it to. I'm sorry for that. I spent my whole life building things instead. I hope you'll understand someday that they were the same thing. The words in the wood. They were always the same thing. Dad." Laurel read it twice. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket with the first one. Outside, the mill arms were turning. The sun had moved and the shadow of the mill crossed the yard at a different angle, now stretching east toward the orchard's edge, where the border collie was still watching. The bees moved over the apple blossoms in the afternoon quiet. Willa was crouched near the dog, holding her hand out, palm up, talking to him in the low, careful voice she used with things she didn't want to frighten. He wasn't moving toward her, but he was watching her hand. Laurel pressed her palms flat against the workshop floor and felt the concrete Owen had poured smooth and level and solid, and she let out a long breath that she had been holding for longer than this afternoon. She looked at the furniture around her, the dining table with its label for her kitchen, the bookshelf for her main room, the small rocking chair for Willa, all of it labeled and waiting, all of it made by a man who could not find the words for what he meant, but who had found in 30 years of Saturday mornings another way to say it. They left at 4. Willa fell asleep before they reached the highway. Laurel drove in silence north on 81, the mountains going orange and purple to the east in the last of the afternoon light. She didn't turn on the radio. She needed the silence. She needed to sit with everything she had seen and everything she had read and everything Everett Boone had told her about her father's 30 years of showing up. She thought about all the Saturdays she had believed Owen was fishing, all the Sunday evenings she had called, and he'd said he was just getting back a little tired, and she had thought he meant the tiredness of sitting on a riverbank with a rod. He had meant the tiredness of carrying fieldstone and fitting it by hand. He had meant the tiredness of building a mill. At the apartment, she carried Willa inside and put her on the pull-out couch and covered her with the good blanket. She stood there for a moment looking at her daughter's face, the dark eyelashes, the slight furrow between her brows that she had even in sleep. Then she went to the kitchen counter and laid both letters flat beside each other. She read them again. She put the brass key from the first letter on the counter between the envelopes, and she stood there in her small kitchen above the Birch Street laundry with the commercial washers starting their first night cycle below her, and she looked at everything her father had left her. Not money, not instructions, not apology exactly, though it lived alongside the apology. Something else. Something that had been building for 30 years in a field she had never seen assembled, stone by stone and board by board and jar by jar waiting. She did not sleep that night either. She lay on her mattress on the floor and stared at the ceiling and listened to the washer cycling below and thought about a man who had driven 2 hours every Friday night for 30 years. She did the math the way you do when your mind won't stop working. 30 years, 50 weeks a year, accounting for the Saturday's illness might have kept him home, accounting for winter, accounting for the 2 years he'd spent in the VA with his hip before they fixed it. Still, she arrived at a number somewhere above 1,000. More than 1,000 Saturdays. More than 1,000 round trips on the same two-lane roads through the same Shenandoah Valley countryside, alone in a truck that didn't have working heat in winter, saying he was going fishing. Not fishing, building. He had been building a mill. At some point before dawn, she stopped trying to sleep and got up and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the street below. A delivery truck idled at the corner. A cat moved along the far sidewalk with the particular confidence of animals who own the night hours. The list was still on the refrigerator door. Pay now, pay when you can. She looked at it for a long moment, then she went to work. The weeks that followed had a shape she hadn't expected. Monday through Friday, she poured coffee at Carver's and packed boxes at Fuller and came home at 2:30 and set her alarm for 6. The apartment vibrated. The list stayed on the refrigerator. The bills in the right column did not move to the left column with any particular speed. But on Friday evenings, something had shifted. She found herself watching the clock at Fuller in a way she never had before, not counting down the hours until sleep the way she had for the past 8 months, counting down to something else, counting down to Saturday morning when she would pick up Willa and drive south and the strip malls would fall away and the mountains would come up on the horizon, counting down to the property. She didn't have a name for it yet. She called it the property when she talked about it to Willa, when she talked about it to herself. She didn't call it the farm or the homestead or any of the words that implied she had already claimed it as hers. That claiming felt presumptuous, still even with the deed in her name and the letters in her pocket. The third weekend, she brought cleaning supplies, mop and bucket and 4 bottles of all-purpose cleaner and a box of rags she'd cut from an old flannel shirt of her own. Willa brought her backpack change of clothes, rain boots, flashlight, and a granola bar she had packed herself, which told Laurel something about how seriously her daughter was taking this. They arrived at 11 and Scout was in the yard. That was the name Willa had given the border collie. She had announced it on the drive down the second weekend with the certainty of someone who has been thinking about a problem and arrived at its solution. He's scouting the farm, she'd said, making sure everything's okay. That's what he does. Laurel had said it seemed right, and she had looked in the rearview mirror at her daughter and thought about Owen talking to the bees in a voice low enough that no one could hear. And she had not been surprised that Willa had named a dog the way Owen would have named one. Scout stood near the porch steps when they pulled through the gate, ears forward, tail low. Not wagging, not tucked. Considering. When Laurel got out, he took 2 steps toward her and stopped. When Willa crouched and held out her hand, he sat down where he was and waited. He's thinking about it, Willa said. Give him time, Laurel said. They spent that Saturday cleaning the house. Laurel swept every room twice. She wiped down the empty shelves Owen had built into the walls, running her cloth along the wood and feeling the grain under it. She scrubbed the cast iron sink and the kitchen counter until both surfaces came up clean. Together, she and Willa wrestled the dining table through the front door and set it in the kitchen. Owen's masking tape label was still on the underside. For Laurel's kitchen, and Laurel left it there. Willa dragged the small rocking chair in from the workshop herself, walking backward with the chair held against her chest, and placed it with great deliberateness by the south-facing window in the main room. She sat down in it. She rocked once. She nodded. Good spot, she said. Everett came by at 3. He brought a jar of honey from the hives, dark amber thick, the kind that went opaque in cold weather. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table and the rocking chair by the window and nodded once the way a person nods when something they expected to happen has happened, starting to look like something he said. Laurel poured him coffee. They stood at the kitchen counter and drank it and looked out the window at the mill at the arms moving slowly in the afternoon breeze and didn't say much. It was the kind of quiet that felt familiar, and Laurel recognized that familiarity and understood it. This was Owen's quiet. She had grown up in it. She had spent most of her adult life frustrated by it, and now she was standing inside it again, and it felt unexpectedly like something she had been missing without knowing the word for what was missing. It was the fifth weekend when Laurel found the third letter. She was in the root cellar rotating jars the way Everett had showed her. Oldest to the front, newest to the back. She was working her way along the bottom shelf, apple cider vinegar, bread and butter pickles. Something dark and labeled simply Apple 2021 when she moved a row of canned tomatoes and felt the wall behind them. Tucked against the stone where the shelf met the back wall, held in place by the weight of the jar in front of it, a white envelope. The number 3 on the front in Owen's printing. She wiped the dust off the envelope with her palm and stood up and opened it in the cool dimness of the root cellar with a jar of tomatoes still in her other hand. Laurel, if you've made it to the root cellar, you're taking this seriously. Good. The preserves on the top shelf are the oldest. Use them first. The peach preserves, second shelf from the top on the left, are from 2 summers ago. They're the best batch I ever put up. Eat them on toast. You'll see what I mean. Then a space. Then I know about Marcus. I've known for a while. I saw it at Willa's birthday 3 years ago, the party at the house in Kieseltown. He corrected you in front of his mother. It was something small, something about directions. You said one thing and he said you were wrong, and the way he said it was the way a person talks to someone who isn't quite competent. You went quiet after that, for the rest of the afternoon. I recognized that quiet because I had seen it before. I saw it in your mother's face in the years before she left, except she was the one doing it, and I was the one going quiet. I should have said something to you, I know that, but you wouldn't have listened. You were still trying to make it work, and if I had pushed, it would have put distance between us that we didn't have enough to spare. So I kept quiet and I kept building. I'm sorry, Laurel. I should have been braver, but I want you to know that I saw you. Even when I couldn't say it, I always saw you. Dad. She read it once and then again, and then a third time. She sat down on the stone step just inside the root cellar door, with the afternoon light falling across her knees and the smell of earth and vinegar around her, and she read it a third time. The anger came first. That was how it always went with her father. The thing underneath the thing took a moment to arrive. She felt anger at Owen first, at the man who had been there, who had been standing in the same room, who had watched and seen and known and said nothing, who had been right there at Willa's birthday party, close enough to say one single word, and had chosen silence instead. Who had driven home that evening and come back the next weekend and spent the day putting up apple butter. And then the anger turned inward because he was right. She knew he was right. 3 years ago, she had still been inside the story, still writing the ending, where it worked out, still explaining away the corrections and the silences, and the way Marcus always managed to be the most important person in any room he entered. If Owen had said something, if he had pulled her aside in the kitchen at Willa's birthday and told her what he saw, she would have defended Marcus. She would have been careful with Owen for months afterward. She would have told herself that her father didn't understand. She knew all of that with absolute clarity, sitting on the stone step of his root cellar, and the knowing of it was its own particular weight. Outside, she could hear Willa singing to herself somewhere in the orchard. A song she'd learned at school, something Laurel didn't recognize, a made-up melody over the words. And beneath it, just audible, the slow creak of the mill arms in the afternoon wind. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket with the others. She climbed out of the root cellar and walked to the porch and sat on the bench Owen had labeled Porch Faces the Orchard. She looked at the trees. Willa was moving between the rows of wine saps in her rain boots, scout walking behind her at a distance of about 10 feet his tail, at a cautious half-mast. The quietest person in her life had been paying the most attention. She sat with that for a long time. Pauline asked about it on a Monday. They were at Carver's before the breakfast rush, the light still thin through the plate glass windows, the coffee already made. Laurel was filling salt shakers. Pauline was doing the morning count at the register, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair. "You've been different lately," Pauline said. She didn't look up from the register. Different how Pauline shrugged. "Like you went somewhere and came back with something you didn't have before." Laurel filled a salt shaker. "My father left me some property," she said. 47 acres down in Rockingham County. He built a stone mill on it, 4 stories. He built it himself over 30 years and never told anyone. Pauline stopped counting. She set the bills down and looked at Laurel over the top of her readers. A stone mill, a working one. The arms still turn. Pauline was quiet for a moment. She was a woman who had raised 3 kids alone after her husband left, and she had rebuilt her life with the deliberate patience of someone who has learned that rebuilding takes longer than people say and costs more and is also eventually worth it. The quiet ones build the loudest things, Pauline said. My grandfather was the same way. Didn't talk about what he was thinking, showed up one day with a whole barn he'd built in secret and expected everyone to understand. She looked at Laurel steadily. Is it a good place? It's a beautiful place. Then go beyond it. It's complicated. The custody schedule, the jobs, the apartment. Pauline went back to her counting. Good is always complicated, she said. Doesn't mean it isn't good. That Saturday, Marcus came. Laurel had half expected it. She had seen it in the way he'd looked at her the previous Sunday at the custody exchange. That inventory looked the one he'd always had, the one that took stock of everything in front of him and categorized it by usefulness. She had stood straighter at that exchange than she had in years, had felt it in herself, the difference in her posture, the fact that she wasn't automatically angling her body to take up less space. Marcus had noticed. He always noticed. She was on a ladder, painting the shutters a dark green she had found at the hardware store in Singer's Glen. The same green that had been on the shutters originally, she thought the color Owen had chosen, and she was returning to when she heard a car engine on the gravel. Not Everett's truck. Different pitch, smoother, the sound of something newer. She looked down from the ladder. A silver sedan came through the oaks and stopped in the yard. She climbed down. She wiped paint from her hands onto her jeans. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which was slightly faster than usual, and she was aware of her hands, which were steady. Willa had stopped painting the lower shutter. She set her brush across the top of the paint can and looked at the car. "Mama," she said, "that's Dad's car. I see it." Marcus got out. He stood in the yard and looked at the property the way he always looked at real estate, methodically starting at the boundaries and working inward. He looked at the fence line and the orchard and the workshop and the house. He looked at the mill. He looked at the mill for a long time. Then he looked at Laurel. "This is what Owen left," he said. It wasn't a question. "This is what Owen built," Laurel said. Marcus walked toward the house. He stepped onto the porch and ran his hand along the railing. Not the way you touch something to feel it, the way you touch something to assess its condition. He looked at the porch boards, the door frame, the ceiling of the porch overhead. "How many acres?" he said. 47. Who's maintaining it? "The neighbor helps. I come weekends." Marcus nodded slowly. He was processing. She knew his processing face, the slight jaw tension, the way his eyes went slightly unfocused when he was running numbers. She had spent 11 years learning his faces. He turned to look at her. Laurel. His voice had settled into the tone he used when he wanted to seem patient, reasonable, slightly parental. "You should have disclosed this in the settlement. There was nothing to disclose. I didn't know about it. You didn't know your father owned 47 acres. Nobody knew. He kept it to himself." Marcus crossed his arms. "That's convenient." She felt it then, the old thing, the familiar contraction, the shrinking feeling, the pull toward making herself smaller so the conversation could end without friction. She had spent 11 years learning to do that without knowing she was doing it, until the absence of it afterward. The 8 months of absence had taught her what it had cost. She let the feeling come. She stood on the porch her father had built and let it move through her the way you let a wave pass when you've learned to stop fighting the water. And then it was gone, and she was still standing in the same place. My father purchased this land in 1989, she said. He bought it with money he saved before he was married. It was never part of our marital estate. It passed to me through his estate after our divorce was finalized. There is nothing to disclose because there was nothing to disclose. Marcus's expression shifted. The patient's mask slipped, and underneath it was something that wasn't anger exactly, something more controlled than anger. Frustration at being outside information, at finding a room he didn't have a key to. He looked at the mill again. She could see him calculating the heritage value of a working 19th century stone mill in the Shenandoah Valley, the kind of money a property like this commanded from buyers with specific interests. My attorney thinks we should talk, he said. There's nothing to talk about, Laurel said. This is my property. My father left it to me. That's the end of the conversation. Something moved behind Marcus's eyes. He was looking for the angle and not finding one. For 11 years, she had found ways to soften, to redirect, to turn the hard edges of disagreement into something rounder and more manageable. She had done it so consistently and for so long that he had forgotten or never learned that the capacity for the hard edge was still there. He put his hands in his pockets. He looked at the mill one more time. Then he walked to his car without saying anything else, got in, and backed down the dirt track through the oaks. She stood on the porch until the sound of his engine faded completely into the trees. Her breath was even. The mill was turning. Willa came to stand beside her. She had paint on her left hand from the shutterwork. She looked at the empty space where the car had been. He left. He left. Is he mad? Laurel sat down on the porch steps. Willa sat beside her. Scout appeared from around the corner of the workshop and lay down at their feet, his chin on his paws. He's not happy, Laurel said. But that's not our problem. Marcus's mother came the following Saturday. Laurel was in the garden, turning the soil in the raised beds Owen had built, pulling the winter's worth of weeds from between the wood frames. Willa and Scout were in the orchard. A car she didn't recognize pulled through the gate and stopped in the yard. A woman got out. Mid-60s, dressed for somewhere other than a farm ivory blouse, pressed dark slacks, sunglasses pushed up on her head. She moved with the practiced posture of someone who had spent decades being the most composed person in a room. Laurel recognized her immediately. Renata Marcus's mother said, as if they were meeting at a dinner party. Her eyes moved over the property with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making assessments. She took in the house, the workshop, the orchard, the mill. She looked at the mill for a long time. Then she looked at Laurel. Marcus says you're refusing to discuss the property. Marcus says what he wants to say, Laurel said. The property's legal status isn't up for discussion. My lawyer has already reviewed it. Your lawyer. Renata's voice carried the particular inflection of someone who has spent decades being right. Owen was a groundskeeper. He maintained public parks for a county salary. She paused. I find it difficult to believe he could have built anything of significant value. Laurel set her weeding tool down on the edge of the raised bed. She didn't hear a truck. Everett must have walked down from his place. He did that sometimes when he saw an unfamiliar car on the road. Before she could speak, she heard his footsteps on the porch. He came down the porch steps with the unhurried certainty of a man who has walked slowly toward a lot of things in his life that needed walking toward. He had his cap in his hand. He nodded at Renata. Ma'am, don't believe we've met. I'm Everett Boone. I've been Owen Price's neighbor for 30 years. Renata looked at him. Someone who watched that man build this property from the ground up, Everett said. His voice was even and quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be loud to fill a space. Owen Price was a groundskeeper. That's true. He drove an old truck and lived in a small apartment and by most measures didn't have a great deal. But every weekend for 30 years, that man drove 2 hours each way to this property, and he worked. He built that house. He built that mill, every stone of it placed by hand, every beam fitted and joined. He planted every tree in that orchard. He ran a water line from the spring. He stocked that root cellar. He put his cap back on. He left his daughter a life, he said. Not a fortune, a life. And if your son or you or anyone else thinks they're going to take that from her, you'd better come with something more substantial than an opinion about what a groundskeeper was capable of. Renata looked at Everett. She looked at Laurel. She looked at the mill one more time, the four arms turning slowly in the afternoon light, the stone walls the color of November sky. Then she got back in her car and drove away without speaking again. Everett watched the car go. He put both hands in his pockets. "I'll be on my porch if you need me," he said, and walked back up the road. Laurel stood in the garden and watched him go. Scout had come back from the orchard at some point during the exchange and was sitting near the garden fence. Willa appeared at the orchard gate. "Who was that?" Willa asked. "Nobody who matters," Laurel said. She called Beverly Marsh the following Monday. She asked one question: had anyone else inquired about the property recently? Beverly checked the county recorder's office. There had been one inquiry 6 weeks earlier, a real estate research firm out of Charlottesville, the kind of firm that worked on behalf of buyers who didn't want their interest known yet. Someone had been looking at this property before Owen died. Someone had known what it was worth before Laurel did. She didn't know how Marcus had found out. She thought she might never know. It didn't change anything. The deed was in her name, and Beverly had made that unmistakably clear. The lawyer's office was above a hardware store in Singer's Glen. Beverly Marsh was a straightforward woman in her 50s with short gray hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, in the particular directness of someone who has spent 2 decades resolving property disputes in a rural county and has no patience left for anything other than the facts. Laurel brought the deed, the probate documents, in a timeline she had written out on a legal pad the night before. Beverly read everything twice. She asked 2 questions. She made a single phone call to the Rockingham County Clerk's office that lasted 4 minutes. Then she took off her glasses and set them on the desk. "This is separate property," she said. "Your father acquired it in 1989, 17 years before your marriage. It was never titled jointly, never used as collateral for any marital debt, never in any way commingled with marital assets. It passed to you through your father's estate after the divorce was finalized. Marcus has no claim. Any competent attorney will tell him exactly that. Can he make it difficult? He can file motions. He won't. His attorney will see the same thing I see and advise him accordingly." Laurel paid the consultation fee. She drove back to the property instead of back to Harrisonburg. She sat in the yard for a while with the engine off, looking at the mill. The arms were moving. They were always moving when there was any wind at all, which in the Shenandoah Valley was most of the time. She had started to find the movement comforting in the way you find comforting the things that are always there. The sound of a river, the light from a known window. A week later, Marcus called. It was a Sunday evening. Laurel was at the apartment, the last of a long weekend, at the property, still on her hands in the form of wood shavings she'd missed when she brushed off her jacket. "My attorney says there's no claim," Marcus said. His voice was smaller than his usual voice, the way voices go when the room they've been filling turns out to be less spacious than expected. "I know," Laurel said. "I was just trying to understand the situation." She didn't answer that. They both knew what it was. He hung up. Laurel set the phone down on the kitchen table, Owen's table, which she had moved to the apartment temporarily, which meant the apartment now had one good piece of furniture, and everything else looked even more provisional around it. She looked out the window. The street below was quiet. The laundromat was dark. She felt something close, not with ceremony, not with the particular satisfaction she had imagined closure would have. Just a door going shut in the ordinary way doors go shut without fanfare at the end of a day. She found the 4th letter on the 6th weekend. She was moving furniture, bringing in the bookshelf from the workshop, the tall one Owen had labeled for Laurel's main room, and she needed to take the nightstand drawer out to get the right angle through the bedroom doorway. When she pulled the drawer free, she felt something on the underside, taped to the bottom of the drawer flat against the wood. A white envelope. Number 4. She sat on the edge of the bed, still in its factory plastic, which she kept meaning to remove, and opened it. The directions came first, as they always did. How to light the wood stove, crumpled newspaper stack, kindling in a crosshatch, Add 2 pieces of split wood, no more than 4 inches thick to start. Open the flue damper before lighting. She would know it was open when she felt air moving across the back of her hand. The best wood was the seasoned oak stacked behind the workshop. The rounds with the faded blue mark were from this past autumn and needed another season, but the ones without a mark were ready. Then the bedroom window faces east. I built it that way on purpose. First light hits the orchard. I wanted you to see the trees every morning when you woke up. Not because they're mine, because by the time you're sleeping here, they'll be yours and I wanted you to see them. Laurel sat with that. She got up and went to the window. The orchard was silver in the late afternoon light, the rows running south from the mill, the trees spaced evenly, each one with room to grow. She could see the differences in the older trees, the thicker trunks, the broader crowns. She could see 30 years in those differences, 30 years of returning to the same ground of planting and waiting and tending. I wanted you to see the trees every morning, not because they're mine, because they'll be yours. She stood at that window for a long time. The fifth letter was the one she had been afraid of without knowing she was afraid. She found it 2 weekends later behind the tall bookshelf in the main room taped to the back panel. She had felt it when she was adjusting the shelf's position, a slight irregularity under her hand, a thickness that shouldn't have been there. She peeled it off carefully. White envelope. Number 5. She sat on the main room floor with her back against the bookshelf and opened it. 2 pages, both sides of each. Owen's handwriting getting smaller toward the bottom of each page to fit everything in the letters close together, the lines slightly uneven as if written at different times and different sittings. Laurel, this is the letter I've been putting off. I bought this land the year after you were born. Your mother was already unhappy and I didn't know how to fix it. I couldn't fix her and I couldn't fix myself, and the only thing I knew how to do was build. So I bought 47 acres with money I'd saved from before the service, and I drove out here the first weekend, and I stood in this field, and I looked at what I had, and I thought I can work with this. I told myself it was for the family, a place we'd go together someday. But your mother left, and it was just you and me, and I kept coming anyway. I told myself it was for you, for someday. Then you married Marcus. I sat in the back row at the reception, and I watched him. Not the way you watch someone because you're suspicious of them. I didn't go looking for anything. I just watched. And what I saw was the way his hand sat on your elbow when he walked you to the table. Not guiding, steering. There's a difference. I knew that difference because I had felt the version of it that goes the other direction your mother, in the last years, steering me out of conversations I was in, steering me toward the margins of rooms. I had been on the receiving end of that particular grip. I went home that night and I looked at this place and something changed. Someday became soon. I finished the mill housing that fall. I planted 20 trees. I stocked the root cellar for the first time. I started building the furniture. I tried to say something to you. I rehearsed it on the drive home on Sunday nights. I had whole speeches worked out, versions of them, different ways of approaching it. But every time I called you, you sounded like a woman working very hard to make something work. And every time I was about to say it, I thought she's not ready to hear it. And even if she were, she'd hear criticism instead of love. And the distance between us wasn't something I could afford to widen. So I kept building. I know that's not the right answer. I know there's an argument that the right thing was to say it plainly and accept whatever happened after. Maybe. But I want you to understand what I could and couldn't do and why. I wasn't silent because I didn't care. I was silent because I cared and didn't know how to say so in a way you could hear. This place is what I had instead of those words. Every piece of it. Every stone I lifted and every board I fitted and every tree I planted and every jar I put up in that cellar. It was all the same thing. All of it was me trying to say, I see you. I see what's happening to you. I am not going to let you fall, even if I can't stop it from happening. Even if you have to fall first before you understand that there's somewhere to land. That's what this place is. Not a farm, not a project, a place to land. I love you. I should have said it every day. I didn't say it enough. I'm saying it now in the only way I know how to say things with everything I could build in the time I had. When you sleep in the bedroom I built with the window I faced east, so you'd see the orchard every morning, that's me. When you sit on the porch and hear the mill turning, that's me. When the apples come in September and the trees are heavy and the whole place smells like what autumn is supposed to smell like, that's me telling you. I see you, Laurel. I always saw you. I wasn't going to let you fall. Dad. Laurel sat on the floor of the main room in the last of the afternoon light. She read it once. She read it twice. She did not read it a third time because by the second reading her vision had gone too unsteady for the small print at the bottom of the second page. She cried for the first time since she was 11 years old. Not quietly the way she had imagined she might cry someday over her father, not the composed private grief of an adult. She cried the way she had not allowed herself to cry at the kitchen window when she was 11 years old, watching her mother's car turn the corner. Fully without managing it. The kind of crying that empties out a room inside you that has been closed up for a very long time. Scout came and pressed his head against her knee. He didn't move away. He stayed there with the solid patience of an animal who understands that some things take as long as they take. When she was done, she sat for a while with her hands on the floor palms, flat on the wood Owen had laid. Then she wiped her face and folded the letter and put it with the others in the nightstand drawer. She went outside. The mill was turning in the evening wind. The orchard was going gold in the last light, the rows stretching away from her in their careful order, each tree in the place Owen had chosen for it. She walked to the porch bench, porch faces the orchard, and sat down. Scout settled at her feet. She looked at what her father had built. Not a farm, not a project, a place to land. She looked at it for a long time, the mill and the orchard, and the house and the rows of apple trees going darker as the light went. And she understood finally and completely what she had been holding when she held those letters, what they amounted to. A man who could not say I love you in the ordinary way had spent 30 years saying it in the only language he had, stone and timber and grafted rootstock and jars of apple butter. He had said it 1,000 times in a language she hadn't had the key to until now. She had the key now. She took it out of her jacket pocket and turned it in her fingers, the small brass key that had been folded inside the first letter, the one that opened the workshop. She held it in her palm and looked at the mill arms moving against the darkening sky. She thought about what Pauline had said. Good is always complicated. Doesn't mean it isn't good. She thought someday is now. She called Pauline on Monday morning before the breakfast rush. The diner was quiet, that particular early stillness before the coffee urns finished cycling and the kitchen began its first sounds of the day. Laurel was standing at the window that faced Route 11, watching a delivery truck idle at the light. She had been up since 4:30. She had not been up since 4:30 worrying which was new. She had been up since 4:30 thinking which was different. I'm putting in my notice, she said when Pauline answered. Pauline was quiet for a moment. The farm, she said. The farm. Another pause. Then good. It's about time. That was all. No questions about logistics, no caution about timing, no list of things to consider first. Pauline had raised 3 children alone and rebuilt her life from materials other people would have discarded, and she recognized the sound of a decision that had already been made. Laurel thanked her and hung up and stood at the window until the delivery truck moved through the green light and the street was empty again. Then she called Fuller Logistics and gave her 2 weeks' notice to a man named Greg, who said he was sorry to lose her and sounded like he meant it in the mild way of someone who is sorry about most things briefly and then moves on. She looked at the list on the refrigerator, the 2 columns, the black marker on the back of the takeout menu. Pay now. Pay when you can. She looked at it for a long moment, the way you look at something you have looked at so many times it has stopped being visible, and you are now seeing it again for the first time in months. She peeled it off carefully, the tape leaving a faint shadow on the door. She held it for a moment, the 2 columns, the black marker, the weight of the previous 8 months compressed into something that fit in her hand. She folded it once and put it in her jacket pocket. She didn't throw it away, not because she needed it, because it was part of the story of how she had gotten from there to here, and the story was hers, and you don't throw away the parts of your own story that cost you something to live through. The conversation with Marcus happened the following Sunday at the custody exchange. She had thought about how to say it on the drive over. She had decided on plain and factual the way Beverly Marsh was plain and factual, the way that left no room for the conversation to become something else. Marcus opened the door before she knocked. He had Willa's bag in one hand and the particular expression he wore when he had prepared himself for a conversation he expected to control. Laurel told him she was moving to the property, enrolling Willa in the school district in Singer's Glen. She would like to discuss adjusting the custody arrangement she was proposing Thursday through Sunday, which gave Willa the school week in Rockingham County and gave Marcus the 4 days that aligned best with his work schedule. Marcus stood in the doorway and looked at her. She watched him run through his options. He was looking for the angle and not finding one. Willa had appeared behind him in the hallway. She had her library book under one arm, and she was looking at her mother with an expression that was not quite surprise. Willa rarely looked surprised, but something more alert than usual. Something waiting. "You're serious," Marcus said. "I'm serious." He was quiet for another moment. "Then fine. We'll work it out." It wasn't warmth, it wasn't concession in the generous sense. It was a man recognizing that the ground had shifted in a way he couldn't reverse, and choosing not to spend energy fighting the geography. Laurel had spent 11 years hoping for warmth and learning to accept the functional version. This was the functional version, and it was enough. Willa came through the door and down the porch steps and put her hand in Laurel's hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The apartment took 2 hours to pack. Laurel had known there wasn't much, but she was still surprised by how little there was when she actually pulled it all together. 3 bags of clothes, a box of books, the kitchen things from the thrift store, Willa's drawings from the wall above the pull-out couch. The pull-out couch itself was rented and stayed. The mattress on the floor was hers, and she stood looking at it for a moment and then left it. She would sleep in the bedroom Owen had built with the window that faced east. She loaded the rented truck on a Saturday morning in early June. The sky was pale and clear, and the air had the particular quality of early summer mornings in the valley cool. Still at the edges, warm at the center, everything smelling like cut grass and the night's leftover dew. Willa carried her backpack to the cab herself. She climbed up on the seat and buckled her belt and opened her backpack to check the contents. Change of clothes, rain boots, flashlight, 2 granola bars. This time her current library book about the history of windmills, which she had found at the Singer's Glen branch, and showed Laurel with the particular expression of someone presenting evidence. "Ready?" Willa asked. Laurel closed the back of the truck. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside the Birch Street Laundry. The building vibrated faintly, the commercial washers already going the day, already in its cycles. She looked up at the dark window of the studio. 8 months. It felt longer. It also felt from this side of it like something that had served its purpose and was done. She got in the truck and started the engine. "Ready," she said. They drove south. Scout was in the yard when they pulled through the gate. He stood near the porch steps with his ears forward and his tail moving, not the cautious half wag of the early weeks, but something fuller, more decided, the tail of a dog who has made up his mind about a situation and is no longer hedging. When Willa jumped down from the cab, Scout walked straight to her and pressed his head against her leg, and Willa laughed and put both hands behind his ears, and Laurel stood beside the truck and watched and felt something in her chest loosen in a way she hadn't known was tight. Everett came down the road at noon with a box of mason jars he'd found in his barn. "Figured you might want these for the preserving season," he said. He looked at the truck and the boxes stacked on the porch and the way Scout was helping supervise the unloading by lying in the middle of the path and requiring everyone to step around him. Everett set the jars on the porch railing. He looked at Laurel. "Owen would be glad," he said. He went back up the road. That was all he said, and it was enough. The summer moved the way summers move on working land, not in weeks and months, but in tasks. The garden first. The raised beds Owen had built needed turning and amending the soil gone compact over the winter months when nobody was tending it. Laurel worked the beds in the mornings. Before the heat came up, Willa beside her, both of them, in their old clothes with their hands in the dirt. They planted tomatoes and green beans and peppers and a row of basil along the south edge of the bed closest to the house. Everett brought starter plants for herbs, thyme, and sage, and flat-leaf parsley, and crouched beside the beds for 20 minutes explaining the particular drainage requirements of each, without ever making it sound like instruction, just conversation, the way a person talks about things. They know the way they know their own hands. The orchard needed attention too. Several of the younger trees had suckers at the base, vigorous shoots growing from the rootstock below the graft that would overtake the fruiting wood if left alone. Everett showed Laurel how to identify them and remove them cleanly. She spent an afternoon working her way along the rows, Willa trailing behind, asking questions about grafting that Everett answered with the patience of a man who has nothing more pressing to do than explain something to a curious child. Your grandfather learned this from a library book, Everett told Willa. Willa considered this. Which library? Singer's Glen Branch. Willa already had her card. The mill required its own education. Owen had left books in the workshop, a small shelf of them tucked on a board above the second drawer. Books on mill writing and traditional timber joinery and the operation of wind-powered machinery. Some of them library books with due dates stamped in the back that were years past, which told Laurel he had simply kept them, which told her something else about Owen and his relationship to systems and rules, in the quiet way he arranged his life, according to his own sense of what mattered. She read them in the evening, sitting on the porch with Scout at her feet. She read about spur gears and brake wheels, and the way the millstones needed to be dressed periodically, the furrows recut to keep the grinding efficient. She read about the mechanics of how the cap rotated to face into the wind, a system Owen had rebuilt from scratch, the original mechanism long since rusted away when he had first come to the property. The first time she climbed all 4 floors of the mill, she went alone. Willa was with Everett, who had shown her where the wild blackberries grew along his fence line and taken her with a bucket to pick them. Laurel climbed the mill stairs, heavy timber stairs, and closed the air inside the mill, cool and smelling of stone and something older. Some mineral smell of the deep walls past the main floor, with its great timber gearing past the second floor, with its empty shelving, past the third floor where the auxiliary mechanism lived up to the 4th floor, and out through the small door onto the cap platform. She stood there in the afternoon wind. The valley spread out below her in every direction. The fields and fence lines, the woodlots and creek bottoms, the farm set back from the roads. To the east, the Blue Ridge layered in blue. To the west, the Allegheny Ridges more distant, more purple. The orchard below her ran in its careful rows, the trees in full leaf, dense and green. The house looked small from up here, the garden beds visible as dark rectangles to the south. The mill arm passed her in its slow rotation. She felt the movement of it in the platform beneath her feet, a slight vibration, rhythmic, the whole structure alive with it. She understood standing up there what Owen had been doing when he climbed the same platform on Saturday evenings before driving home. The problems that looked smaller from up here, that was not metaphor, it was instruction. She stood until the wind picked up and the arms began moving faster and the platform hummed under her, and then she climbed back down. In August, she found the 6th letter. She was checking the 3rd floor mechanism, the auxiliary gearing Owen had rebuilt, and she ran her hand along the main timber beam to check for any softening that might indicate moisture intrusion in the wood. Her fingers found a gap in the beam where a large knot had fallen out years ago, leaving a hollow roughly the size of her fist. Inside the hollow, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, a white envelope. Number 6. She sat down on the 3rd floor boards and opened it. The oilcloth had protected it perfectly. The paper was dry, the printing as clear as the day Owen had written it. Laurel, if you found this one, you've climbed all 4 floors of the mill. Good. You've seen what it looks like from up there. That's the view I built it for. Not for me. I knew the view when I built it. I built it so you would have it. The valley looks different from up there. I think you already know that. I think you've already stood in the wind and seen how the problems look smaller. That's on purpose. Everything in this place is on purpose, even the things that look accidental, especially those. One more thing I should have said: I was never disappointed in you. Not once, not ever for anything. The divorce, the hard years, the times you didn't call when maybe you should have. None of it. I was your father. I knew what you were dealing with. I just wished I could have made it easier. I couldn't make it easier. So I built you a mill. Dad. Laurel sat on the third floor boards of the mill her father had built stone by stone and read that letter twice. Outside the mill walls, the August wind moved through the valley. She could hear the arms rotating above her, the slow groan of the timber, the mill alive around her. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. Then she climbed to the fourth floor and stood on the cap platform in the afternoon wind for a long time. In September, the apples came in. It happened over the course of about 3 weeks, variety by variety, in the order Everett had described on that first walkthrough. The wine sap's first deep red and firm, the tartness of them making the back of her jaw ache in the particular pleasurable way of good tart fruit. Then the Arkansas black, smaller and denser, the skin so dark it was nearly purple. Then the Newtown pippins, pale and sweet, the kind of apple that smells like apple the way no other apple quite does. Laurel walked the rows every morning before Willa's school bus came. It had become her routine without her designing it: coffee on the porch, in the first thin light, Scout beside her, and then a walk through the trees. She learned which trees were ready by the way the fruit sat on the branch, by the way it released when she cupped one in her palm and lifted slightly. She learned the smell of the orchard in the mornings, which was different from the smell of it in the afternoons, cooler and more precise, the dew on the grass carrying the apple scent down low. Owen had planted these trees over 30 years. He had chosen each variety, each location. He had learned to graft from a library book and practiced on sticks before touching the trees. He had carried water to the young ones in dry summers, bucket by bucket, from the spring before the gravity line was in. She knew this because Everett told her, one piece at a time, on Saturday mornings. The Saturday mornings had become their own institution. Everett arrived at 8 and Laurel poured coffee, and they sat on the porch and looked at the orchard and the mill and talked about Owen or didn't, and either way it was the same kind of morning. Willa joined them, sometimes asking questions about whatever was in her current library book. Scout lay between their chairs, his chin on his front paws, watching the mill, the way he watched most things, with patience, without urgency. Everett told her things the letters hadn't covered. Owen had hummed while he worked the same melody, something Everett had never been able to identify, but stopped the moment he realized anyone was listening. Owen had carried a level everywhere during the years he was building the mill, checking his work, constantly unable to let a course of stone go without verifying it. Owen had once walked 3 miles to return a library book because his truck wouldn't start and the book was due, and he was not the kind of man who kept a library book past its due date, which made the shelf of overdue books in the workshop all the more interesting. He must have decided they were worth the fine, Laurel said. Everett smiled his small private smile. I think he decided some things were worth what they cost, he said. The Saturday market in Singer's Glen started in early October. Laurel set up a folding table between a woman named Deb, who sold beeswax candles, and a man named Howard, who grew heirloom tomatoes on 50 acres outside of Broadway. She brought apples sorted into paper bags by variety, each bag labeled in her own handwriting. The variety name and a brief note about the flavor profile, the way Owen's jars were labeled with precision and without excess. And she brought honey. The honey from Owen's 3 hives was darker than most of what the market sold, with a depth of flavor that Deb tasted from a sample jar, and then stood quietly with her eyes slightly unfocused, the way people stand when they're tasting something that requires their full attention. Your bees make good honey, Deb said. My father's bees, Laurel said. I'm the new management. She sold out of honey by 11:30. She sold out of apples by 1. The following week, she brought twice as much of both and sold out by 2. People asked about the mill. A man who restored historic properties in the northern Shenandoah Valley stood at her table for 20 minutes, asking questions about the stone construction and the cap mechanism and whether the millstones were original. A woman who ran heritage tours out of Staunton asked if Laurel had considered opening the mill to visitors on certain weekends. Laurel said she was considering everything and meant it. She had not thought about what the mill could become. She had been thinking about what it was. But standing at her market table in October with apples and honey, and the mill visible on clear days as a gray rectangle above the tree line 3 miles south, she began to think about the other question. Not what it was, what it could do. She didn't have the answer yet, but she was asking the question, which was further than she'd been. The workshop on the first Saturday of November happened by accident. A young woman named Petra came to the market table with a toddler on her hip and a canvas bag on her shoulder, and the expression Laurel recognized because she had worn it herself for 8 months. Not despair exactly, but the particular exhaustion of someone whose list of things they don't know how to do is longer than the list of things they do. She bought a jar of honey and a bag of pippins. She stood at the table for a moment after the transaction was complete, the way people stand when they want to say something and aren't sure how. "I heard you live out there alone," Petra said, "on that property, with your daughter." "I do." "How do you do it?" "I mean the place itself, the maintenance. I don't know how to fix anything. My husband left 4 months ago and the kitchen faucet has been dripping since August, and I can't afford a plumber, and every time I hear it, I just—" She stopped. Her toddler was pulling at the strap of her bag. "Come out to the property next Saturday," Laurel said. "I'll show you how to fix a faucet." Petra looked at her. "Really? Really? Bring the make and model of the faucet if you can find it. We'll sort it out." Petra came. She brought a friend named Joanna who had a different problem, a door that wouldn't hang right, and Laurel addressed both. She showed them how to shut off the water supply, how to identify the type of faucet valve, how to replace a worn washer. She showed Joanna how to check a door hinge and shim it with a piece of cardboard. She had not known she knew these things until she stood in Owen's workshop and picked up his tools and found that the knowledge was already there. He had taught her without teaching her the way he did most things by doing them in front of her until the doing became familiar. The following Saturday, 4 women came. Laurel showed them how to put up canned tomatoes. Owen's method from the notebook she'd found in the root cellar in his handwriting, the steps numbered and precise. Hot water bath, sterilized jars, the particular sound of a good seal. Everett arrived at noon with a box of mason jars and sat on the porch while they worked and didn't say anything except when Laurel got the first jar sealed and inverted correctly, a single quiet good. By the first Saturday of December, there were 8 women coming to the property most weekends. Laurel had not named it or announced it or made any particular plan. It had assembled itself the way things assemble when there is a need and a place and a person willing to show up for it. She showed them how to sharpen a knife properly, the whetstone at the right angle, the motion that feels wrong at first and then settles into sense. She showed them how to patch drywall. She showed them how to start seeds in winter, how to read a property deed, how to check a circuit breaker and what it meant when one wouldn't reset, how to read the grain of wood before you cut it so the saw goes with the fiber instead of against it, something Owen had shown her once, without words, guiding her hand along a plank until she felt the difference herself. One of the women, Petra, asked her a question one afternoon that stayed with her. They were in the workshop, Petra practicing the whetstone technique on a paring knife, the sound of it rhythmic and increasingly correct. "How does it feel?" Petra asked, "knowing it's really yours, like no one can come and take it?" Laurel thought about it. "It feels like the first solid ground I've stood on in a long time," she said. "Home isn't where they let you stay. It's where nobody can make you leave." Marcus brought Willa on a Friday evening in November. He had adjusted to the new custody schedule with less friction than Laurel had expected, which she attributed partly to his attorney's advice and partly to the fact that Willa had made her own preferences clear in the way children make their preferences clear, not with argument, but with the weight of their happiness, which is hard to argue against when you can see it plainly. Willa was happy here. The kind of happy that was visible in small things, the way she moved through the property with the ease of someone who has learned where the ground is, the way she talked about the orchard and the mill and Scout, to anyone who would listen, the way her drawings had multiplied across the wall of her bedroom until there was almost no wall left. Marcus came to the door himself this time. He had Willa's overnight bag in a manila folder. She talks about this place, he said, constantly. She loves it here. He looked past Laurel at the interior of the house, the table in the kitchen, the bookshelf on the main room wall, the wood stove, the shelves beginning to fill with books and jars of honey, and the small, ordinary objects that accumulate when a place is actually lived in. He held out the folder. Her teacher sent these, he said. Wanted you to see them. Laurel opened the folder. Inside were 5 drawings in colored pencil on white paper. She went through them slowly. The first was the orchard, the rows of trees from above, as if Willa had drawn them from the 4th floor of the mill. Each tree a round green shape in its row. The second was Scout asleep on the porch. His chin on his paws, one ear cocked the porch, boards around him catching the light in careful parallel lines. The third was the root cellar interior. The shelves of jars, each one labeled in Willa's careful printing. The stone walls, the wooden door open to show a rectangle of light. The fourth was the mill. She had drawn it from the east from where you first saw it when you came through the gap in the trees. The stone walls, the 4 floors, the octagonal cap with its 4 arms extended. She had gotten the proportions right, which was not easy. The mill was harder to draw than it looked. The slight inward angle of the walls, the way the cap sat on top of the cylindrical body, and she had drawn the arms in motion suggested by a slight blur at the tips, the way motion blur works in photographs, which Willa had worked out by instinct. The 5th drawing was a man. He was standing among apple trees, the orchard around him in autumn colors, the trees heavy with fruit. He was drawn from a distance, you couldn't see his face clearly, but he was wearing a flannel shirt and work boots, and he had a hand resting on the trunk of one of the older trees. A familiar gesture, the gesture of someone who knows a tree. He was holding something in his other hand, a letter. He was holding a letter. And above his head, small and slightly imprecise, a circle of light, a halo. Laurel looked at the drawing for a long time. Marcus was quiet beside her, watching her look. She heard Willa's boots on the porch steps, and then Willa came through the door with Scout beside her, Scout's tail going wide and continuous. That's the one with Grandpa, Willa said. She came to stand beside Laurel and looked at the drawing. I made the halo small because you said he was quiet. I figured a quiet man would have a quiet halo. She paused. And small doesn't mean less. Laurel looked at her daughter. Small doesn't mean less. No, Willa said with the certainty of someone stating a fact they have thought about carefully. It just means quiet. Laurel looked at the drawing again. The small halo above the man in the flannel shirt standing among his apple trees holding a letter. She put the drawing carefully back in the folder. Marcus was looking at the mill through the kitchen window. Not the way he had looked the first time. Not the appraiser's look, the calculating look. Something different. The look of a person seeing something they hadn't expected to see and not knowing yet what to do with it. He turned from the window. She seems happy, he said. She is, Laurel said. He nodded. He picked up his keys from the counter. He looked once more around the kitchen, the table Owen had built, and labeled for Laurel's kitchen, the shelves Owen had built, and beginning to fill the window over the sink that looked out toward the mill. He left. Laurel stood in the kitchen and listened to his car back down the gravel track through the oaks and disappear. She felt the quiet, neutral fact of something finished, a chapter that had run its course, nothing more and nothing less. She looked at Willa, who was sitting in the small rocking chair by the window, feeding Scout a piece of apple she'd brought in from the basket by the door. Willa looked up. Dinner, Laurel said. Scout wants some too, Willa said. She found the last letter in September. She was walking the wine-sap row in the morning, the earliest light still low and horizontal, the dew heavy on the grass. Her hands moved along the branches the way they had learned to move, checking the set of the fruit, feeling for the slight softness at the shoulder that meant a day or two more, the firmness at the base that meant ready now. Her hand found the hollow in the oldest tree. The oldest wine sap was at the end of the southernmost row, the first variety Owen had planted. The tree, Everett said, had gone in the ground in the first year. Its trunk was thick now, the bark deeply furrowed, the crown wide and high. The hollow was natural, a place where a branch had come down in a storm years ago, and the wound had sealed over imperfectly, leaving a gap large enough for a small package. Inside the gap, in a Ziploc bag, a white envelope, the number 7 on the front. Laurel sat down at the base of the tree. The grass was wet, and she didn't care. Scout lay down beside her. The morning light moved across the orchard in the slow way. Morning light moves in September, not fast, not urgent, taking its time. She opened the envelope. Laurel, you found them all. That means you know every corner of this place. Good. It belongs to you now, and it knows you belong to it. I don't have instructions this time. You don't need them anymore. I want to tell you something I should have said in person. I love you, Laurel. I always did. I loved you when you were small and I held you and couldn't believe something that little could be that important. I loved you when you were 11 and you stood at that window and didn't make a sound, and I put my hand on your shoulder and couldn't find the words. I loved you when you called on Sunday evenings and told me you were fine when you weren't, and I said okay, and I wish I had said more. I loved you every Sunday night when I drove home from here, tired and sore, and satisfied knowing that everything I'd built that weekend was one more piece of a place you'd never have to earn or explain or defend. A place that would be yours completely without condition. I loved you, and I didn't say it enough. I didn't say it in the right ways. I said it with my hands instead, the only way I knew. I hope the trees say it for me now. They'll be here longer than words. Every fall when the apples come in, that's me. Every spring when the blossoms open, that's me again. When the mill turns in the wind, that's me. When the water comes down from the spring and the bees work the orchard, and the root cellar is full, all of it always, that's me telling you. This isn't my place anymore. It's yours. Take care of the bees. Keep the root cellar stocked. Oil the planes twice a year. Linseed not tongue. Check the mill cap housing every spring for softwood. The eastern face gets the most weather. And be happy, Laurel. You've earned it. I promise you've earned it. I love you. Dad. She sat at the base of the oldest tree in the orchard and held the letter in both hands and looked up through the branches at the September sky, pale and wide and very clear. She wasn't crying. She was past crying, or the crying had already happened, and what came after it was this, a stillness she hadn't known before. Something settled all the way down to the bottom, to the place where the grief and the anger and the long frustration had lived, and it was quiet there now. Not empty. Quiet. The way the orchard was quiet in the early morning, not absence of sound, but presence of something more fundamental than sound, the sound of things continuing. Scout pressed his nose against her hand. Above her, the branches were heavy with wine saps, the fruit dark red in the morning light, bending the branches, the way ripe fruit bends branches in September, with that particular graceful weight. She put the letter in her pocket with the others. All 7 of them, in her jacket pocket, the paper soft from reading the folds worn. She would put them in the nightstand drawer when she went in. She would keep them there. She stood up and picked 3 wine saps from the tree and walked back through the rows toward the house. The mill was turning in the morning wind. The 4 arms moved against the sky in their slow rotation, the canvas pale in the low light, the stone walls the color of old pewter. From here she could see all 4 floors of it, the base thick and settled into the ground as if it had grown there, the upper walls tapering slightly, the cap at the top with its turning arms. A groundskeeper had built that, a man who drove an old truck and lived in a small apartment and ate soup from a can and told his daughter he was going fishing. He had built it with his hands stone by stone over 30 years of weekends, and he had built it for her, and she was here. She walked past the mill toward the house. The garden beds were full, the tomatoes nearly finished, now the basil going to seed, the last of the green beans still heavy on their vines. The root cellar was stocked for winter. The bees were still working the late flowers along the orchard edge, the white asters and the goldenrod that had come up along the fence line. Inside, she could hear Willa moving around in the kitchen, the sound of a cabinet opening, the particular thud of the cast iron skillet on the burner. She came up the porch steps. Scout went ahead of her and lay down by the door. She went inside. That December, Everett told her the story. It was a Saturday morning in the first cold week frost on the grass, the orchard bare the branches dark against the pale sky. They were on the porch with their coffee Scout between their chairs, Willa drawing at the kitchen table inside. The mill was visible above the tree line, the arms moving slowly in the light northwest wind. "I want to tell you something," Everett said. He had his cap pulled low and his coffee held in both hands. He was looking at the orchard the way he always looked at it, with the ease of 30 years of looking. "The day Owen first came here," he said, "fall of 1989. I was out fixing my fence line, the north fence, the one that runs along the road, and I saw a truck pull off onto the shoulder. Old blue truck, the one he had before the Chevy. Young man, maybe 35, flannel shirt, work boots. He got out and walked through the gate and up the track, and he stood in the yard right about where you park now, right in that spot." Everett paused. "He didn't move," he said. "Didn't walk around, didn't look at the outbuildings, didn't pace the way people do when they're sizing something up. He just stood completely still and looked. At the trees, the hills, the field. Stood there for 10 minutes in the cold without moving. I watched him the whole time, wondering what he was doing." Laurel looked at the yard, at the place where she parked. "Then he said 2 words," Everett said. "I was close enough to hear. 2 words, and he got back in his truck and drove away." "What did he say?" Everett turned and looked at her. "He said, 'This is it.'" Laurel looked at the mill, at the orchard, at the gate down the track through the oaks, where the morning light was coming through in long horizontal bars. "He came back the next weekend," Everett said, "had a bag of apple seedlings and a shovel. And he came back every weekend after that for the rest of his life." They sat with that for a while. The mill arms turned, the frost on the grass caught the morning light and held at each blade a small, bright thing, the whole field of them together making something larger than any one of them was alone. "Thank you," Laurel said, "for being his friend, for being here." Everett looked into his coffee. "He was easy to be friends with," he said. "You just had to pay attention." They sat in the cold and drank their coffee and didn't say anything else for a while. Inside, Willa was humming something improvised, made up a melody that didn't go anywhere in particular and didn't need to. The mill turned in the wind. Laurel sat on the bench Owen had built and labeled and carried through the workshop door and saved for the porch of a house he had built for her. And she looked at the place he had made, and she thought about a man standing in a yard in 1989 saying 2 words to nobody in particular because nobody was there to say them, to only the trees and the hills and the field. "This is it." She put her coffee down on the railing. She stood up. She walked down the porch steps and across the frost-stiff grass to the place where she always parked, the place Everett had pointed to. She stood there. She looked at what Owen had looked at. The mill, the house, the orchard, the gate down the track through the old oaks where the morning light was still coming through in bars, the light moving and shifting as the branches moved, never exactly the same twice. Scout had followed her. He sat beside her in the cold and looked at the same thing she was looking at. Behind her, the kitchen door opened. Willa stood on the porch in her socks, holding her mug of warm apple cider with both hands she had taken to drinking it in the mornings from the cider Owen had put up 2 autumns ago, the last batch he had made. She looked at her mother standing in the yard in the frost. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Just standing," Laurel said. Willa came down the steps and stood beside her. Scout moved between them. They stood together in the cold and looked at what Owen had built, the 3 of them, or 4 if you counted the man in the flannel shirt with the quiet halo which Laurel did. Then she said it, not loudly, not with ceremony, just the words in the ordinary morning air, the way Owen had said them in the fall of 1989, when he was 35 and had a shovel in his truck and the whole long work of it still ahead of him. "This is it," she said. Willa slipped her hand into Laurel's hand, and it was.